Okay, next let's start making a bounce platform. So let's create a new C# script and we're going to call this one bounce pad. Awesome. I'm going to open that up. Alright, we're going to need a few things. We're going to need serializable float that is called force amount. Set that to 10 to start with, but we're definitely going to have to change that. And then we're going to need a float for time. And we're going to set this equal to 1 to start off with, and then we're going to have a float called player CD, and we're going to set that equal to 0.1f. Okay. And we do not need start. And then we're going to go, and just in void update, we're going to go time if time is less than 2. Doesn't actually need to be 2, but for the sake of this, time plus equals, see, we could just set it to like 1, because it's plus equals time, capital T for the unity time, dot delta time. Okay. We're also going to need a rigid body. I'm going to call that RB, and then we're going to start doing our collision stuff. So on collision enter, RB, oops, I don't want to do that, RB equals collision dot game object dot get component rigid body. Then we're going to check if the rigid body exists. RB does not equal null. And then if that is the case, so we're missing a bracket here, so let's add that back in before we forget. We're going to calculate a vector free, so we're going to go vector free, and we call this one force direction. And we're going to set that equal to transform dot up. So we're going to apply a force direction in the up direction, but before we actually use the force direction, we're just going to normalize it. Force direction dot normalize. Normalize with capital N. So that's going to set it to a nice round number for us, and then we're going to go RB dot add force. We're going to add it in the force direction. Then we're going to multiply the force. Can I end up in the right spot? I'm going to multiply force by force amount. We're going to do a little calculation here. We're going to put brackets around force amount, and we're going to multiply our force amount by RB dot mass. Okay, and then we are going to use force mode dot impulse. Okay, so let's unpack what we just wrote there. But let's do the last line of code here. RB equals null. So we're going to reset our rigid body after each time we use it so that it doesn't call multiple times. Okay, so when we collide with the object, we check if the object, well, this will be on a bounce pad. So when an object collides with it, we're going to check if the object has a rigid body. If it does have a rigid body, we're going to calculate the up direction from the bounce pad. We're going to normalize it to give us a nice number so we don't get a real wacky number. If it's on a funny angle or something, it's going to normalize it a little bit. And then we're going to add a force in the force direction, and we're going to multiply it by our force amount, and then we times our force amount by the RB's mass. So if you have different objects with different masses, they're all going to bounce in the same way. And then we use a force mode of impulse, which means we apply the force all at once in one go at the start. So it should be just a direct, they hit it, the force is applied. Okay, now let's put, I forgot to put an if statement around this. So this is for if it's not the player. We didn't want it, active soft part. Being lazy and pressing tab a lot because it kind of gets it right. Dot tag does not equal player. Let's put the brackets around. Alright, so if it's not a player game object, we're going to do it just like this. Now, for the player, we want to do a little bit more. So first, we're going to go else if time is greater than player cooldown. And then let's write all our code in that. So the reason why we do this is sometimes the player has multiple parts. So if we hit with multiple parts of the player within a small period of time, sometimes you get launched really inconsistently. You could do this check with a normal object, but generally you're not really bouncing a heap of normal objects. It might be something they've just thrown against it. It doesn't usually cause the same problem, but if you did find that other stuff was causing that problem, you should put a little cooldown here. So the player can jump pretty fast, but the player shouldn't be jumping more than a tenth of a second apart because he should be being bounced quite high each time by the bounce pad. Alright, so we also probably want a reference for our player. No, we don't need it actually. So we're going to go collision dot game object dot get component. Actually, the part of the player that collides might not be the part that holds the rigid body. So let's get a reference to the player. Let's get a game object player. And then let's bring in void start. Let's not do this in runtime. Let's do it on start. Let's find the player. What am I doing here? Void start. Go. And then we go if. We should make this. So I've done this a few times before. Semicolon. Let's Let's make this not look crap. Let's fix that up. Okay. So if our player is null, we're gonna set our player to equal to an object that has a player controller on its game object, which is always going to be our player. All right. If time is greater than player's cooldown, so let's go here, and then let's say if player does not equal null, and then we're going to go bring this down like this. Then we're going to go, yep. Sometimes Visual Studio knows what you want to do next, so we're going to grab that, and then we're going to change the RB dot velocity is equal to new vector free. Set it to RB dot velocity dot x 0, comma RB dot velocity dot z. Okay, so what we've done then is we've just zeroed out the velocity on the y-axis. So if the player's coming faster or slower towards the bounce pad, he's not going to get an inconsistent bounce amount. We're going to bounce the same amount no matter how high he falls onto the bounce pad. Now, if you wanted it to bounce at inconsistent amounts, you could remove this because you might have a trampoline sort of effect instead of a boosting effect, and you might be wanting to take this in and adding force based on how fast the player is hitting, but we don't want to do that in our example. So let's just copy and paste some code. So we're going to once again make a vector free, call it force direction. We're going to normalize it again. In fact, we're going to literally do exactly the same from here on out. So the only difference is we care a little bit more about how consistent the bounce on our player is. This is just to handle if something that's not the player hits. When it's the player, we want it to be a very flushed out experience. You could go in further and do that with the objects if you needed to, but sometimes it's just easier to keep things a bit streamlined. You also could, let's go time equals 0. You could also just run just this code on collision, just this bit here. Actually no, because you're finding the player's rigid body via the player component, but you could run just this exact same code in this other if statement. We could do that if we wanted to. Just simply add this line here, and it's exactly the same. The only difference is we found the rigid body. So let's go test this out. Also, this is not gonna be enough force. I know for sure. All right, let's pick a color again. Let's go create material. We're going to create what have we not done yet? We've not done a purple. Let's do a purple. We're going to call this material bounce pad map. Let's create a 3D object, cube. Let's do it the same way as we did. What was the platform? What did we do? 5 by 2. 0.2. Let's call this bounce pad. Uh, 5.2. Let's put the purple on it. Let's move it down a little bit, and then let's put the bounce pad script on. Now, we can, for performance, if we want, manually drag the player on, but I often am too lazy to do that. Sometimes you have to place 100 of these pads, and then if you have to put the player on every time, it's a lot. But it is expensive to find objects that way, but we run it only a single time, so it's not the end of the world. That's why we have things like loading screens. All right, let's test our bounce pad. All right, so when we jump on it, what happens? Oh, okay. So I changed the force amount to 100, thinking this probably would not be that much force, but we are proper flying. That's really interesting. And then we're coming back down, and we're gonna. Oh, we fell through the floor. Okay, that's not ideal. But that has nothing to do with this not working properly. So it's on the player, on his rigid body on the player. Let's set our collision detection to be continuous and dynamic. Let's see if that fixes the problem. Okay, let's leave the force as 100. Actually, let's test the 10 force first. That feels a little bit more appropriate, but not quite enough. Let's try like 20. So I don't know why I keep jumping on and off. I could just leave him there and change these statistics. How high do we want our player to bounce? I feel like that's a fun amount. It really depends on your level design, but I think that's sort of where I probably would be happy with it. Maybe you want it to be bigger. Let's go set this back to 100. Oh. Alright, so the player got launched again. And now we just patiently wait for him to come back down. Let's see if he falls through the floor again, or if that's enough added. Collision detection to stop it. Ooh, okay. It's a really weird behavior that happened then, but he did not fall through the floor. It did sort of like stutter him. Okay. Let's go like this. It's not ideal to apply way too much force to objects, but I think at least he shouldn't easily fall through the floor anymore. So look, we're pretty happy with that. He bounces. Now, like how he had to fix before, if you hit the side of this, it's still going to bounce you. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. If you didn't want that, I don't actually care. You could make it like the moving platform where this happens on a trigger enter, and that trigger enter is only on the top. The trigger zone is only on the top, like we did with the moving platform where we had a trigger zone. You could do the exact same thing, but I don't think it's actually required for this one. All right, I think next we'll do some speed and slow ones in the next episode, and then I think we're probably pretty good to start doing some level design. So maybe we'll look into finding some assets so we can make it look pretty, and we'll skip the grey boxing stage and just go straight into doing a basic level. Okay, thanks. See you in the next video.